And I'll also be looking out for any new ones coming in. So, if you want to click on the last session that we're on and ask anything that's occurred to you, we'll try to get that too. So we've got like half an hour. We want to really, just draw together some of the themes and pose some new questions maybe. Do we need to know everyone's names again? Do we want to do a speed round? I think you've seen them all, but real quick, just who you are, what you study here.
I'm Ben Kellison. I'm the director of our grid research practice. Pretty much anything and everything that touches our grid edge practice or any of our connections to the broader WoodMac research portfolio.
Yeah, so Alta Cola, research manager for the grid edge practice. So I kind of, see day-to-day grid edge and kind of the sweet spot for research on DER services and wholesale markets.
Hey everyone, I'm Brett Simon. I'm a senior analyst on our energy storage team. My bailiwick is US behind the meter energy storage.
Fei Wang, Grid Edge, Senior Analyst, Customer Energy Management.
All right, so I wanted to start kind of big picture. That we've been seeing these facts flying fast and furious at us all day today and yesterday. Could each of you say something that kind of stuck out and really just lodged in your mind? Maybe it was surprising, maybe it was counterintuitive, but we want to send people home with some things to brag about, over the water cooler. So curious from your panels or other things you saw, what was one fact or observation that really stuck with you?
Yeah, I actually had several follow-ups with folks after panels talking about distribution planning. And in particular, we started talking about that maybe 2014, late 2013, as a barrier for DR adoption, as a barrier for advanced distribution equipment adoption, as a barrier for a lot of things in the way of optimizing our grid. And I will say it's not that encouraging what I had heard from folks. So kind of second and third wave states, and I say that those waves meaning the folks that would be first wave would be the ones that had high solar penetration or had a mandate to develop a process for non-wires alternatives identification and adoption, where they were pushed to get their distribution planning system in better shape. I would expect after 5 years that we were in better shape and folks would be looking at that process of modernizing as a couple of year process, not a 5-year, 10-year outlook, and it looks like we have a lot of work to do.
So the planning for better planning is taking 5 years. Is that?
Yeah, that is actually a very succinct way of saying what was 2 hours of conversations yesterday.
Okay. Yeah. Well, Elta, what about you? What are you going to take home?
Yeah, so I'm actually, I've been thinking a lot during this conference, like from my first one to kind of the fourth one here. And I think going along with what Ben is saying, kind of the complexity, and I think I said this morning, I think the conversations we've been having are just a lot more complex, a lot more integrated, a lot more looking at our back-end systems and how we make them talk to each other, and especially, and I think the best term I heard, and I'm going to continue to use this, was mind mapping data.
Mind mapping
data, because I think, that kind of visualizes it for me as to we have to map it to where it needs to go and where it has value. So again, I think complexity is kind of what I came out of this event with.
Brett?
Yeah, so kind of building off what my two colleagues have already said, and I'm going to use a specific case from my previous panel where I was speaking with Jason from LADWP, is not only the complexity of the challenges we have to solve, but also the very short time frame we've set ourselves in many cases. So the example from LADWP is this procurement of distributed energy resources and setting up a management system for them in only 10 years, which is not very much time if you think about it, especially given some of the challenges that we have to think about even before we integrate the DERs, just looking at interconnection protocols, thinking about how do we set up business models for these systems, who owns the systems, how do we finance them, how do we figure out the risk profiles. All those are difficult questions, and as we see some of the examples of different initiatives across the country with some of the, for instance, the PBR initiatives that Faye outlined, all that's very exciting, as are some of these 100% renewable or 50% renewable, whatever the portfolio standards are. But the time frame we have to meet some of these goals is in some cases, a decade, decade and a half, that's not much time.
Definitely.
That's a lot less than we've been in this industry.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, when I look at customer programs, this is my third conference. Actually, my first day at this job was the first day of a conference 2 years ago. So that was overwhelming, but I feel like I'm a lot more well-adjusted now. But when I look at customer programs for the last 2 years, there were a lot of trying to hit the participation targets, trying to achieve certain goals. But a lot of the times, the initiatives or the drivers behind that is to take advantage of some kind of rebates and achieve some kind of regulatory line. But right now, I think I am seeing a lot more of utilities carrying that sort of flexibility from customers, how that actually impacts the physical grid. And there are programs to actually test it, to study it, to understand it. So I'm very happy to see that connection. And I did hear agreements from other attendees here, but maybe because people who don't agree with me didn't come to talk to me. But I'm glad that there were conversations happening that do see this trend coming together.
Yeah, and for me, this was my third time coming to this conference, and something that struck me was a lot more steel in the ground now. I think in the past, there's always been a kind of theoretical, forward-looking element to describing the grid edge. It's still very forward-looking, obviously, but at least there was a proliferation of actual projects and utilities really building stuff and implementing stuff, and then having some initial observations from the field. So it's this funny situation where it's both way further along than it's ever been, and still super early in the broader vision of what all this technology could be doing. But that seemed like a definite improvement. So I wanted to do a quick kind of round through each of your sort of focus areas and just see if you could sum up like what you see the state of play as being, and where you think it's headed in broad terms, what the key challenges are to get there. And I'll just sort of call out what I want you to address. But Faye, could you catch us up on the whole like home energy device world? How would you describe like the state of evolution that we're in today? And then where do you think it could be or should be in the next few years? But what would be the key obstacles you identify to standing in the way of that?
Yeah, so when you see, say, home energy management, a lot of times people are still trying to say, let's get the customers to care about how much they're consuming. I feel like that fewer and fewer people are trying to do that. It's more, how does that inform the grid? How does that inform operations of utilities? So I do see that connection. But in terms of home energy management, I do think, I mentioned this in my presentation, voice is going to play a big role, not necessarily in the sense that utilities are going to only talk to customers via this voice application, but customers are going to continue to adopt that technology. And that is going to be the brain of a smart home, probably is for a lot of people already. So it will be interesting to see the big vendors providing this technology, the Amazons, the Googles in the world, how they are providing this platform, and how customers are continue to kind of latch on to the services they're providing.
Yeah, okay, so Brett, you look at behind the meter storage, commercial scale, residential scale. What's like the quick version of where that market's at today, and what the near-term growth potential is?
Yeah, great question. So today the market is growing very rapidly, and we are forecasting that it will continue to grow. I think the story for the next few years is going to be more diversification of markets. Especially if you look at the C&I market, it's been very heavily concentrated in California over the last 5 years or so. Over 90% of the capacity going in, and the reason for that is fairly simple. There's the lucrative self-generation incentive program that's been helping that market along. There's been opportunities for demand charge management, and even some cases of procurements to deploy for wholesale market services, resource adequacy and the like. But what we're seeing is, there's starting to be a little more diversity. In the early 2020s for the commercial market, we're going to see both New York and Massachusetts open up in a big way. Massachusetts has the SMART program, which officially opened in 2018. So we'll start to see those systems coming online in later this year, but really more so in early 2020 and beyond, given some of the interconnection challenges and also timeline for getting projects online. And then in New York, we've seen a number of initiatives. There's the Storage Bridge Incentive, which has been pretty exciting. There have been some changes to the Value of Distributed Energy Resources program that have created more certainty for some of the pieces of the value stack. So that's pretty exciting. And on the residential side, I mean, we continue to see growth, in California, Hawaii, but again, the Northeast continues to grow. A lot of it is emotional adoption, frankly, for backup, but we are seeing some exciting use cases from utilities, whether it's Green Mountain Power in Vermont that's procuring storage and has just deployed it to actually cut peak demand and cut some of their R&S costs for ISO New England. Liberty Utilities in New Hampshire has been kind of following on the heels of that with their own program that's starting to open up in the near future. And then earlier Ann from Sunrun mentioned that they are going to be deploying storage, solar plus storage systems in Massachusetts for the forward capacity market. So that's pretty exciting that we will see these residential systems leveraged to provide real value to the grid.
Great. Okay, Elta, let's talk about. Oh yeah.
If I may, I just want to follow up. So I've been looking at some of the data that you all have put out in the last month or two, and it seems like I think it was 4 out of the last 6 quarters, we've had over 100 CNI systems deployed. Still very low numbers. Mm-hmm. Does the market shift at all towards certain industries versus just kind of buckshot approach to states that have incentives? And in the next 5 years, is there a time where that's kind of expected?
Yeah, it's a good question. And in terms of actual customer subsegmentation, it still depends on markets, but nevertheless, you're kind of seeing some common themes. So one is going to be customers who have very peaky loads in a lot of cases, just because then you can make the demand charge case pencil out. But also customers who generally have multiple sites are very attractive. So we've seen more CNI storage companies start to deploy and sign contracts with universities, school districts, in some cases healthcare, because in many cases these are places that both need savings as well as resilience, and from one contract you can deploy multiple systems across multiple sites and really scale. And lastly, especially in the case of universities, they're willing to generally accept a longer payback period than private industry. So if you look at, for example, the SGIP program, the data sets publicly available, the educational subsegment has seen quite a bit of uptake under that program.
Gotcha. Okay. Quick version, Elta. How about demand response? We were talking earlier, kind of off stage about the state of the art for most demand response programs being picking up a phone and calling a large industrial or commercial customer. What's like the short capsule version of like what cool things are happening in that space and where it's headed?
Yeah, how smart it's going to get, right? I mean, it's interesting because when we think about like DR resources and participating in wholesale markets, you don't think about like manufacturing and like, diesel backup generators, but that's kind of the reality, right? So sometimes, we have to live in our reality today and there is a place that we want to go, but we kind of have to understand that, right? So I think that flexible portfolio of about 32 gigawatts, that number is not going to change so much, but I think kind of how the resources are aggregated and how they play. And I think, obviously, like we've seen the EPA regulations back in 2016, you kind of started to see a bit of a shift away from diesel, knocking some of that out of the market. Some of it came back with retrofits. But I think like from a capacity standpoint, it's not going to change. I think, where we've seen some markets, we've seen them saturated actually. I think PJM's regulation market, for instance, that's kind of where storage flooded at the beginning.
Yep.
And then, so I think we have to kind of be careful because the competitive landscape is really getting very tight. So I think that kind of, when you're looking for shared revenues from markets, I don't actually think it's going to be the state of play for some of kind of the people that are up and coming in the markets. And as I mentioned during my presentation this morning, it's more going to be like a leasing of software to aggregate these resources, and those, market players that, no markets bid into markets, those are the ones that are going to continue to play in that. But I think the software play is where kind of the competitiveness will be, but they're not going to look to get shared revenues.
Gotcha. Okay. Then we'll just, for Ben, could you talk about the DERMS and the state of software and controls for utilities to actually manipulate and operate all of these DERs? I mean, is that deployment and sophistication moving as fast as you thought it would a few years ago, or not?
Yeah, I'd say the DERMS DMS connection is not going as quickly as I think a lot of us had hoped, and I think that's partially because as an industry, there have been some really excellent working groups put together, but working groups mean time. Hopefully that leads to something good, but when you go into the documents that come out of those working groups and there's 700 requirements or more across 2 spreadsheets, it's awfully hard to take on that effort without a lot of executive support to integrate a DERMS and a DMS. What has been really interesting, actually, that we've run into with some, we'll say off-the-record discussions with some utilities, is there has not been as much of a focus on having the system today. In some cases, they're contracting a system, understanding that 3 years later, if that vendor doesn't make significant progress towards what they think they're going to need then they'll switch over to a different platform. So I think that's actually a really good thing for the industry, considering we've definitely had our challenges in certain enterprise software markets where we've developed a really cool solution, and then a big company buys that solution and just ekes out every last dollar they can until they start losing competitive their market share, and then puts a little bit of money into it maybe, or dumps it completely. It'd be really nice if we had a little bit more of a consistent development flow, which that's the positive of going towards some of these shorter term contracts and SaaS contracts.
Yeah, keeping it more fluid so you're not locked in over long haul.
And you can see people's performance along the way and make sure that you're actually getting features in a competitive market from the competition from the market, which is hard because usually enterprise software markets end up aggregating to just a few players.
Yeah.
And anybody who's had to put in EAM or a CIS system, there really aren't that many places to go, and it's difficult, to say the least.
Right. Okay, so those were some high-level takeaways. Now we're going to just do grab bag, all kinds of questions from all of you that we've collected over the days. This one's came up in a lot of different contexts, but the idea of death by pilot and that, utilities are famous for doing lots of pilots and studying and then eventually maybe deploying more or not. And do you have any thoughts on how to accelerate that timeline from pilot to commercial orders? Are there any parts of the grid edge where you've seen some like hopeful examples of speeding up that uptake process?
Maybe I'll start here. I think like the whole piloting process, you have to actually look at how long it takes to get something through a regulatory process, like 3 to 5 years. So if you don't pilot and get it right, and you get that through the regulator and it goes very wrong, right, you have a big problem on your hands for the next time that you want to do something really cool and innovative. So yes, we talk about, this like pilotitis and piloting to death, but it's kind of like we have to do it to a certain extent. So.
Yeah. Okay. So the in defense of pilots.
Yeah. I mean, I came out with a little bit more of a positive takeaway, but maybe Ben has a counter to it.
No, I think the most difficult thing we run into is not necessarily knowing what we need or want.
Yeah.
So I think it's really hard for us to determine the difference in some cases between pilots and demonstrations. And we don't often make that line when we talk in these types of settings.
It's true.
Demonstrations just, hey, does this stuff work? Like, how does it work? Get in there, tinker with it, understand it, and can my employees actually do this, or do I have to completely change my business to get something done? Versus pilots. If we're doing pilots, we should be doing pilots to deploy something. It may be in a limited context. It may not be 100% of the territory, but the end goal should be to get something out, and I think that's something that we need to be more clear about in the industry, even in RFPs for that matter, to say that you're likely not going to have a full-scale contract come the end of this demonstration. So I think those lines get muddled way too frequently.
Yeah, no,
And,
very good point.
One of the projects I mentioned in the presentation in terms of energy management, the Green Mountain Power water heater program, I guess in strict sense it's actually a demonstration project because it is to test whether technology works, and it did not. And it provided lessons learned for other programs people are interested in. But the reality is the communication technology, what protocol to use, how does that work? How do the utility staff members run this program? These are things that definitely need a test bed first to figure out, because then you're actually going to impact people's ability to receive services reliably. So.
Yeah. Okay. Moving on to.
I just want to add one thing.
Okay.
One thing we don't do frequently enough is say when we failed. And that's something that just doesn't get around for a lot of these projects, and it's one of the most difficult things we run into to get information to clients on how not to do something, because we spent $3 million on a pilot over here, and that's what actually caused the failure, not what gets around in the way of we learned so much and whatnot. So
that's a really good point. And yeah, and from the reporting side, sometimes we'll often cover the announcement up front, and then sometimes things just sort of never materialize, and there's never a formal announcement of that, and you have to kind of think, hey, I covered that, what happened, and then track it down, and then but the failures have a lot of lessons that are valuable too. So yeah, okay, this is kind of a fun hypothetical. If you had to choose between owning and controlling tens of thousands of smart inverters or millions of smart meters, which would you pick? Kind of a fun hypothetical for the grid edge world.
Well, in Australia, not the smart inverters, I would say, because of kind of all that backfeed that they've had. So if I had to choose right away, that example came into my mind, and because of the manufacturer setting. So that's why I'd have to look at the manufacturer settings first. But
yeah, I guess in terms of what you could do with those tools, where's the biggest bang for your buck?
Am I regulatorily facing, or am I just on my own? Because if I'm facing a regulator,
You're talking to analysts here.
so I can say I'm customer centric and I know what they're doing and I'm trying to help them along. But if I'm just a utility, I want the connection to the smart inverters. I want some ability to control, because they're going to be putting out as much power as being used, and that's the thing that's going to cause my models to screw up.
Interesting. Okay. Let's see. Okay, this is important. Yeah, how are utilities with successful analytics programs ensuring that the value promised by the use case is actually realized within business units after implementation? Kind of like the core of actually doing all this is that it should actually work. And are you seeing the proper amount of attention paid to that verification and metrics after the fact?
I think it's too soon to kind of, talk about this, to be honest. I think what we've learned from at least the sessions here in the last 2 days, it's a little too soon.
It depends on the application, what you're doing, right?
Because
you can say, we've been doing analytics one way or another, since we had spreadsheets, technically, right?
In some cases, we still have a lot of spreadsheets.
Yeah, but it very much depends on the application, who's using it, et cetera. Like, I think my favorite one is I spent 3 months trying to track down at one point a business model for condition-based maintenance, right? How do you determine if you made back what you expected? And the answer was you talked to a bunch of utilities, and they tracked it really, really well until they saved a large asset. Once they saved something that was worth $1 million plus, $2 million plus, $3 million plus, and made their money back on the development or installation of that analytics application, no one asked the question anymore. Regulators are happy, CEO happy, C-level guys happy, executives happy. So a lot of it comes down to what is the driver behind what you actually are doing and what the analytic application
is. It just did we make back the investment, or is it the full life cycle?
A process. If it's a process, it's a whole nother thing, right?
Yeah.
If you're talking about trying to make end-to-end data flows go, you do get complaints when things break.
Okay. Switching gears a little for Faye, should utilities be worried about sharing customer data with Google and Amazon through their voice services?
Well, first of all, they already have your data, so they're not,
interested
in this.
It's too late.
It's too late. But utilities should figure out a way to share what they have to help the service providers to provide products and services more effectively. So one example I think Alta and I have looked into in the past few months is in California, there are vendors participating in DRAM programs that this is all public information. You can look up the proceedings and filings. And so one vendor claimed to have savings that is much larger than all their customers combined. So there were obviously some issues with it, and there were also additional issues with this vendor going into, while asking customers username and password and going into the utility's website and basically scrape the data and then use that as the basis for their analytics. And so there are a lot of conflicts between what the utilities want the vendors to do and say, please stop stealing our data, don't do this, versus vendors say, well, you're not giving me enough for me to do my job properly. So there is, I'm sure there are working groups going forward figuring out how to share that data effectively and mask all the personal information. It's more aggregated data, but that mechanism is not there yet, and that will be necessary going forward for vendors to participate in programs like DRAM.
Yeah, I mean, there are cases where utilities have opened up the data, anonymously, and invited the vendor community to be like, hey, what is it that you can do with this data to service our customers, right? So that's also something to keep in mind, too, that you can open it up in a safe way to the third-party community without, impacting the customers in a negative way.
Gotcha. Okay, so super lightning round for a few more of these ones from the audience here. Will the green suit make an appearance at the next GTM event? I can only say you should come to that event and find out.
July 30th, come to Boston. We're having the Northeast Solar and Storage Conference. Shameless plug. It's
Shameless
gonna be great.
plug. It's I think that's a legitimate plug. Okay, this one's fun. What technology does a smart grid need that was missed from the discussions this week? Are there any blind spots? If we could have one more tech that we just kind of snapped and it appeared, what would you want?
I mean, I feel like this is always the push and pull, right? There's always like, oh, there's got to be some like special mechanism. I don't want to say silver bullet. I'm just going to say silver bullet to save time. There's got to be some silver bullet. There's got to be something we haven't thought of, And I don't know. I'm a big believer in Occam's razor that often the simplest solution is the best. So I think it's less of a question of, to me at least, what technology do we need rather than how do we take what we have and implement it effectively.
Gotcha. Any other picks for that one?
Information sharing between different stakeholders in a more effective way. What is that effective way? I have no idea, but an effective way to share information so we can work a little bit better together and a little bit less against each other.
The most exciting technology is good communication. Okay, what about, is the grid edge conversation really important from a climate perspective? We weren't necessarily addressing greenhouse gases head-on in some of these conversations, but how does this all fit into that?
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think also to use an example from storage, the SGIP in California, one of the goals was to lower greenhouse gas emissions. They did a study released after a few years of the program and found actually, in fact, that in general, SGIP was raising greenhouse gas emissions because storage systems were not discharging and charging in such a way as to reduce peak on the grid. They were reducing peak for customers, but not necessarily aligning with the grid. So designing effective mechanisms, in this case a greenhouse gas signal, are really important for ensuring that these technologies are not making the problem worse.
So there's a world where a savvy grid edge thing makes a fossil fuel burning grid more resilient, but you could also, if you structure it right and incentivize it right, have real climate impacts in a beneficial way? I
mean, we are in California, right? So I don't know how many of you have heard this, but after the wildfires, a bunch of people went out and bought fuel-based, mostly diesel generators, and that increased emissions. So that was kind of a reaction to the market, right? And that happened at the grid edge behind the meter. So I don't know, should we be thinking about solutions there where we already kind of have an interconnection queue ready, you know, for solar plus storage backup, so people don't go out and buy these diesel backup generators, they go and buy a solar plus storage system.
Yeah, and that was the point Ann made, right?
Yeah.
That when the mailers go out from PG&E, they shouldn't just say, get fuel for your generator. They should say, hey, there's a variety of options. And I think something heartening in recent days, actually, is that Generac, one of the big generator companies, is getting into the solar plus storage space.
So I think there's one big caveat there, and this was my big clarification with wildfires. We're not talking 3-hour, 4-hour outages. We're not even talking 6-hour outages. We're talking 48-hour plus. And we're not going to be able to get that in solar plus storage systems that are economic today. So is there a place? Yes. Should solar be involved in there from an energy perspective? Yes, the incentives are great, and there's definitely opportunities there. But you're going to have something in addition to that. Hopefully it's something that's better than a diesel genset. Hopefully it's a fuel cell or natural gas generator, and there's gas connection that's a little bit better. But we have to figure out how to get those longer term solutions in this area, and honestly, it's going to have to come from investment on the utility side to allow these lines to continue to run, at least inside the towns. Because some of the commentaries, and I haven't caught up with this in the last month, but they were actually looking at turn off distribution feeders in suburbs. Like, if we can't run feeders in suburbs, then we're going to have a lot of problems. If you want those things to run, you need to have some ability to have the towns at least electrified, so you can have plants that are a bit larger. You can have a storage array that's large to be able to provide that 48-hour view.
And from a regulatory perspective, there are 9 states and Washington, D.C. and Puerto Rico already have decarbonization goals that are 100%. They're either debating it or they're already enacted into law. So, and that really affects how utilities are being regulated, how they, if they were to adopt grid edge technologies that are more cost effective, how do they get revenue from this? How are they treated regulatory accounting-wise? So these are details that are very related to how do you achieve those climate goals. Yeah.
Gotcha. Well, we are technically out of time. There was a question, is there a happy hour today? Not officially, as far as I know, but there are many good bars in this town. So you can take that upon yourselves to organize in a decentralized fashion. But I think with that, I want to wrap it up. I'll just say you'll get an email about a survey, and if you take that survey, you get all those slides, which is great. You know, we want to hear how you like this, if you learned some things, if there's anything you'd like more focus on. That all helps us, you know, make the event better and more tailored to your needs and desires. So really appreciate that input. And with that, could we give a round of applause to our analysts helping us wrap this up? All right, and safe travels home, everybody.